I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. On June 13th, Israel launched attacks on several military and nuclear facilities in Iran, marking the beginning of a 12-day war between the two countries. The United States followed with targeted strikes on Iranian nuclear sites to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power and posing a threat to regional and global stability. China's involvement in the conflict was limited to condemning the Israeli and U.S. use of military force and calling for de-escalation. At least based on public reporting, Beijing provided only rhetorical support for Tehran. To discuss what the Israel-Iran war reveals about China's relationship with Iran, its evolving strategy in the Middle East, and the broader implications for U.S.-China competition, I'm joined today by Dr. Yun Sun. Yun is a senior fellow, co-director of the East Asia program, and director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Her recent piece in The Wire China, entitled How China Sees Iran's Future, provides a nuanced take on Beijing's calculus during and after the war. So thanks so much for joining China Global today, Yun.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start by asking you how you would analyze the actions that Beijing took during the war and after it was over. What were the interests that China was seeking to advance or protect? And what does this tell us about China's diplomacy in the Middle East?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I think just to begin with, what people have noted during the crisis was basically the Chinese diplomatic and rhetorical support of Iran and the strong condemnation of Israel's military activities. But at the same time, a lack of material support or military support or financial support, any type of substantive commitment in terms of providing more support for Iran, which has been significantly weakened during the recent years, and precisely during the war. I think in terms of what that reveals about China's diplomacy towards the Middle East, I think it comes back to a more nuanced understanding of the axis of evil, if you will, or CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So what type of relationship do they really have behind this title, axis of evil? They don't have mutual defense. That we know, which pretty much excludes the axis of evil as a military alliance. But now we're seeing there's not even mutual support other than diplomatic and rhetorical support for each other in the event of war. I think that raises a question about what this alignment or this coalition really entails in terms of their real capacity to support each other in a military crisis or in a military conflict. The interest I think China is trying to protect in the Middle East, of course, there's UN Charter, there's the issue of sovereignty, there's also the issue of non-aggression and respect of territorial integrity, and also the issue of national security of Iran. But I think more broadly, what the Chinese are trying to preserve in the Middle East is a continuation of the Iranian regime or the Iranian country as a player in the region. We know that China's approach to the Middle East is more of a balancing diplomacy. So it does not put all its eggs in one basket, be it the Gulf states or Iran or Turkey. I see that looking into the future, China will continue to pursue this balanced approach, but which also means that in the Middle East region, when China sees all these U.S. allies and U.S. partners and U.S. dominant role in the regional security architecture, I think there's a strong interest on China's part to preserve Iran as a different voice in the region. Maybe not entirely a substantive and a strong ally in terms of anti-U.S. alliance, because we really haven't seen much of military cooperation coming to the most recent military conflict. But at the same time, I think the very existence of Iran in the Middle East serves China's interest.
So some of the analysts who've written about China's role or the absence of China's role in the conflict have argued that it really underscored that China is not a great power in the same sense as the United States is, because it did not really use any leverage that it has over Tehran, and of course, it buys a great deal of Iranian oil, so it certainly does have some leverage over Iran. But I'm curious whether you share that take. Do you think that the failure of China to play a much more proactive role demonstrates that its power is really quite limited, and its influence in the region is quite limited?
That's a really interesting angle because if we look at China's role in the region, we know that China has never been the security provider in the region, right? That role is reserved for the United States. And honestly, I don't think China wants to take up that role. When they look at the complex regional relationships and they look at China's primary interest in the region, which has been energy security or the Middle Eastern oil, as we know, is 53% of China's crude oil import still comes from the region. So that's the production of oil and also the transportation of oil. So if you think of China as a primarily an economic player, because we know that China's investment and trade with the Middle East region has grown exponentially in the past 5 years, then I think the Chinese probably would argue that, well, the security role is not something that China has tried to pursue in the region anyway. So whether China is a great power in the world or in the region, there may not be just one criteria that it has to be a military power to be a great power in the region. Well, China can be a great economic power in the region, right? And some of these relationships are transactional. And we are seeing that China wants to or try to play a bigger role in terms of the Saudi-Iran deal of 2023 and in terms of the Beijing Declaration of the 14 factions within the Palestinian movement in July of 2024. But that role is still relatively nascent. I think we all agree that China is not a established player in the Middle East. Actually, before China became dependent on Middle Eastern oil, I would say that China's interest in the region was pretty minimal. Traditionally, Middle East is seen as a strategic arena or strategic theater for Russia to play the dominant role. So China was more reserved in terms of a more forward-leaning position in the Middle East. So a lot of these things is a process. It's not a yes or no question. Yes, China is, or no, China is not. I would say that China's role has been growing, but I don't see in the foreseeable future China will be able to compete or to surpass the United States in terms of the role of a security provider in the Middle East region.
In your article in The Wire, one of the points you made I found really interesting that I wanted to ask you to elaborate on. You wrote that China was not willing to provide material or military support for Tehran due to its external strategic blunders. So, what do you have in mind when you refer to strategic blunders, and what's China's criticism? What are the interests that are involved in that?
Yeah, I think the observation is quite interesting here in China. And when I surveyed the opinions within the Chinese domain, and you see how the Chinese analysis about Iran and why Iran has been significantly weakened in recent years, it points to basically two things. There is domestic politics that the Chinese do not necessarily agree with theocracy, and they also see the corruption, the ineffectiveness and the chaos in terms of the decision making within the Iranian government structure. But there's quite a strong criticism of the domestic political performance of the Iranian government. And that's a really interesting observation to begin with. Because very rarely China makes this type of open or public discussion in an extremely critical tone of another country's governance and its regime, right? And secondly, I think coming to China's interest when China looks at Iran and Iran's strategic alignment choices in the recent years, I think there is a strong sense of dissatisfaction and also a strong sense of discontent that Iran has not been more aligned with China. So in the Chinese relation, whenever Iranian got the olive branch extended from the United States or from Europe to negotiate on its nuclear weapons program, or its nuclear program, the Iranian would run to those offers. So in a sense, China has been treated as a secondary option, or not the best choice, but it's a secondary option or backup plan that Iran preserves because of the international sanction, and Iran does not have the ability to develop closer commercial relationship with Western companies. There's an observation that Iranians are unwilling to sign deals with Chinese, for example, oil companies, because they believe that they can get better deals from French Total, for example, when the international sanctions are lifted. So that comes back to JCPOA, and we see that Iran has made the effort to resume the JCPOA in the hope that it can open up the international space for economic relations. But that has not happened so far. So China is left with as a one choice. So what the Chinese have been criticizing Iran, or the strongest criticism that has come up in the most recent episode, is what the Chinese call a surrender tendency on the Iranian part. That if they had the opportunity to negotiate the West, they would negotiate the West instead of pursuing closer, for example, strategic alignment with Russia and with China, basically with countries of shared ideology. And last but not least, there's a very interesting observation that comes down to Iran's relationship with Pakistan and India. Because in the Chinese view, Iran shares a border with Pakistan. China has a China-Pakistan economic corridor. So if Iran wants to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, then it's only natural for Iran to link itself up with Pakistan, right? But in actuality, what the Chinese have observed is that Iran has instead tried to pursue a much closer alignment or relationship with India compared to its relationship with Pakistan. Two examples are cited. One is, in this past May, we also saw a 4-day war between Pakistan and India, right? But on the second day that India started to attack Pakistan, the Iranian foreign minister flew to New Delhi in order to reaffirm what was quoted as strategic cooperation on all levels. So I think for Chinese, the question is, well, Iran, you're a Muslim country, and India is attacking another Muslim country. So why would you choose this timing to have such a significant gesture towards India, which basically undermines your relationship with Pakistan? Another example, I think, that touches more sensitive nerves of China is the development of the port of Chabahar, which is a joint development program between the Iranian government and India. But we know that Chabahar is extremely close to Gwadar, which has been under development between China and Pakistan. We also know that, well, for such a geographically clustered region, Chabahar and Gwadar are basically next door to each other. So you don't necessarily need two mega ports so closely located to each other. So I think for China, the development of Chabahar port presents a direct competition to Gwadar, which raises the question that, well, why is Iran making this choice, right? So I think when China looks at Iran's external relationship, is a desire to build better relationship with the United States, desire to negotiate and build better relationship with the West, practically, and is a relationship with India compared to its relationship with Pakistan. So I think the Chinese can't help but ask questions: where does Iran's priority or strategic priority really lies? That are you prioritizing the West over China and the crink, if you will, or maybe that you should reconsider? And I think this time, especially after the 12-day war between Iran and Israel and the United States, I think the Chinese are trying to observe that, well, where is Iran going to go next? Are you going to continue your capitulation tendency to try to basically negotiated with the United States, and after being what the Chinese observe as being deceived by the United States in terms of the negotiation in Oman, or you will finally wake up and make up your mind and try to repair and develop better relationship with your partners, and who are your real friends? I think it's a question that the Chinese can't help but asking.
This is really fascinating. I hadn't realized that the Chinese have so many suspicions and skepticisms about Iran's intention. But let me follow up and ask about whether this explanation that you have given explains about why in 2021 that agreement that was signed, the 25-year, 400 billion economic cooperation agreement, is that explain why, in fact, we really haven't seen much of that implemented? As you noted again in your article, the Chinese investment has only reached just under $4 billion, which was at the end of 2023. So are those the reasons? If you were to put yourself in Tehran's shoes, did they see China as maybe responsible in any way for the relationship not being stronger? Do you know anything about that side of the story?
Yeah, well, there are two sides of the story, right? So on the Chinese side, the grievances is that Iranians are not giving um are not showing enough loyalty to this relationship or giving us good enough deals for us to invest. And honestly, I think the fact that the Chinese cumulative investment in Iran remains so low, basically we're already 4 years into that 25-year agreement and nothing really has happened. And remember, President Raisi visited China in early 2023 in order to show that Iran is very eager to pursue economic cooperation with China, and still the investment figure and the trade figure is skewed because a lot of the Iranian oil are going to China through Malaysia, so not directly to from Iran to China. So the trade figure is not necessarily a true reflection of the extent of bilateral trade. But if you look at the lack of economic cooperation, I would argue that there are multiple factors at play. The international sanctions, especially the US sanctions on Iran and also the secondary sanctions, I think it does play a role, right? It is a strong deterrence against the Chinese desire or Chinese willingness, or it impose significant costs if China wants to pursue closer economic cooperation with Iran. So from the Chinese perspective, if Iran really wants China to invest, the Iranians will have to offer a good enough deal in order to neutralize those additional costs because of the international sanctions. But that goes back to the Iranian argument that, well, maybe we are not getting the best deal from the Chinese. If we do prioritize the removal of international sanctions, then we can pursue better deals with Western companies instead of Chinese companies. So I do see that both sides have a legitimate argument here. But I think the problem is that without progress in terms of the nuclear negotiation, the international space is not opening up, or it has not opened up. And we are seeing the Iranian domestic economy deteriorating as days goes by. And now with the most recent strike of the Iranian nuclear facility, I think a key question moving forward for China-Iran relationship is that, well, is Iran going to stop pursuing its nuclear weapons program? Well, one would argue that after the attack, the Iranian desire or their determination to pursue nuclear weapons is probably reaffirmed, even compared to before the attack. But that we don't know just yet, right? So looking forward, I think this economic relationship, a lot of it depends on the external environment, but also the alignment strategy. Again, comes back to the question of which partner Iran really prioritizes, knowing that the Chinese probably would not be offering the best deal, but China is willing to offer deals during the time of difficult sanctions. So there's no one correct answer, and this is not unique, right? We're seeing that Russia is also complaining that China has not supported Russia enough in the Russian war in Ukraine. And we're also seeing North Korea complaining that China is keeping North Korea on life support, but they're definitely not well fed. So nothing more than the bare minimum. So I think this is a constant struggle in terms of China's relationship with this authoritarian partners, that neither side feel the deal is good enough for them. So there are a lot of grievances and discontent toward each other. But again, their relationship is primarily defined by the geopolitics, that they do have a shared threat perception about the United States, and that bundles them together.
Beijing generally has not supported other countries acquiring nuclear weapons. So I wanted to ask how concerned you think China has been about the enrichment of uranium in Iran, reportedly to 60%, and then a short period of maybe weeks or a month, reportedly, before actually Tehran would have had the capability to have nuclear weapons. Is this something that when you read the writings of Chinese experts or talk to people in China, are they concerned about a nuclear Iran? And if so, do they really believe that diplomacy could have solved this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think there have been debates as for whether Iran was turning its 60% HEU into a nuclear warhead, right? That even in the US, we have seen that disagreement playing out at quite high level. Um, I think on the Chinese side, I remember the first report I wrote on China-Iran relationship, it goes back to 2010. And even back then, I think the Chinese have decided that Iranian strategy is different from the North Korean strategy, precisely because North Korea had its nuclear test, I believe it was back in 2005, 2006. And Iran realized that if you cross that nuclear weapons threshold, you will be under international sanction. You will be the international pariah, and you will be isolated in an extreme manner. So I think even back then, the Chinese made a determination that the Iranian strategy is not to cross that threshold, but stay under the threshold, have the capability to potentially develop a nuclear weapon, but not through a nuclear test, not an overt crossing the nuclear threshold. So if you believe that is true, then what we have seen in terms of JCPOA is basically Iranian, I think, attempt to charter a midline approach between, on one hand, having HEU and developing that capability, but on the other hand, still not while staying under the nuclear weapon threshold and still maintain a relatively okay relationship or better relationship with the international community, so Iran can still pursue international trade and its economic development, right? So if that is an Iranian strategy, what we have essentially seen is, while the Chinese have finger pointed the United States for withdrawing from JCPOA, for the deal to fall apart and for Iran to go back to its original track, that I think the Chinese argument is, had JCPOA stayed in place, then we would be at a very different place now, and Iran would not have been pushed back to this track of pursuing their program, because they're not getting the deal that they were promised. So how do you expect Iran to continue to observe its commitment reached in the JCPOA when JCPOA had already fallen apart? I agree with you. I don't think the Chinese support nuclear proliferation, but the issue of Iranian nuclear program is more complex than a blank statement that yes, Iran is violating its NPT commitment. It still has not withdrawn from a non-proliferation treaty. It has recently stopped cooperation with IAEA because it believes that IAEA has supplied information and intelligence to Israel, which was used during the airstrikes. So I would say the Chinese approach still goes back to, well, let's prioritize diplomatic negotiation. Let's still find a negotiate diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear program. But that goes back to the question, what is the future of the Iranian nuclear program? Are they going to continue? Are they going to resume to build their centrifuges, for example? So we haven't seen an exact clear answers to those questions. So I think, yes, China is against nuclear proliferation, but I think the Chinese would not in any way support an airstrike of Iran to remove those nuclear programs. So whether there is a diplomatic solution, or there was a diplomatic solution called JCPOA, but it was abandoned. I think that's the caveat the Chinese are trying to raise. They're against nuclear development or nuclear weapons program of Iran, but they don't believe that military approach is the way to go to solve that problem.
So let me ask you a bit about the energy piece and the implications of the war for China's energy security. I think it's about one third, maybe a little bit more, of China's oil imports that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, Iran threatened to close the strait during this conflict. Um, we know that China has moved some of its import of oil from the Middle East. I think you said earlier, it was about 53% that come from the Middle East. More has been coming from Russia. Russia is now the number one supplier of China's energy. But there have been reports that Beijing will now be keener to agree to the building of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline from Russia to northern China that would supply natural gas. And we know there's been reservations about that in the past. So do you agree with that? Do you think that China's now more concerned about its energy security, the vulnerabilities of energy passing through the ocean from the Middle East, and therefore would take the risk of increasing dependency on Russia? My sense is that the Chinese don't like to be overly dependent on any one country, including Russia, for its security. But what's your perspective on that?
Absolutely. China's energy security strategy is primarily based on diversification, right? So it's diversification between external sources and domestic sources. China is building a lot of nuclear reactors in China to reduce its dependence on external energy resources. And externally, it's all about not putting Chinese eggs in one basket. And I've heard different numbers, but I think so. You're right. Last year, Russia was the largest exporter of crude oil to China. It was 19.6%. And the numbers that I have heard, I have seen circulated in the Chinese arena, in the Chinese domain, about the maximum extent of China's energy dependent on one source is 20%. So I wouldn't necessarily see that more dependence on Russia is seen as a secure strategy or a safe strategy to pursue for China either, because we also know that China-Russia relationship is also a quite a monster of itself. There's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of suspicion, skepticism, complaints, discontent against each other. But then again, they share this perspective on the United States. So that's a separate question. And if you look at the Middle East, I think what the Chinese are looking is not just a single country provider, right? Although Russia was the largest single country provider of crude oil last year, if you look at the China's oil import from Saudi, which was number two, and before the Ukraine war, Saudi Arabia was consistently China's largest oil provider for quite a number of years. So if you put Chinese import from Saudi, from Iraq, from Oman, and also from Iran together, I think there's no doubt that Middle East is still the primary source of China's crude oil. And just a quick word on the Power Siberia 2, the pipeline project. I think the primary reason that a deal has not been reached is commercial rather than political. Political, well, natural gas is a future of clean energy, right? It's still different from crude oil. But there's a question as for whether the Chinese ability to absorb more natural gas is limited. So currently, if you look at the Power Siberia 1, I don't believe it has operated at full capacity at all, both because of the limited Russian production of natural gas to supply to this pipeline, and also because of the Chinese limit or the Chinese limited ability to absorb all the natural gas imported. So I think there are other reasons related to why the Power Siberia 2 has not been reached. But coming back to the most recent crisis on Iran, it's a very interesting validation of a Chinese conviction or a conviction among Chinese oil executives that Chinese energy security or dependence on Middle East is susceptible but not vulnerable toward regional turbulences. So when the Iranian parliament raised a proposal that, well, we should shut down the Strait of Hormuz, I think that's a very dire scenario for China, right? Once you shut down the Strait of Hormuz, China, as the largest importer of oil that pass through the strait, will be the first to be victimized. But what we also saw in the crisis during those 12 days is that Iran essentially, in the end, did not take that position. And you would have to wonder why Iran did not take that position. I think that showed the almost a validity or the point that the Chinese oil executives have been making, that when the Strait of Hormuz is shut down, it's not just China's interest that's undermined, right? So the interest of the oil producers and the oil importers in this case, they're on the same page. If the strait is shut down, everybody suffers. It's not just China, but also Japan, South Korea, India. So everyone who imports oil from that region that passes through the strait will be victimized. And in that calculus, U.S. and Israel are not going to be the victim if the Strait of Hormuz is shut down. And if you also think about Iran also uses the strait to export its own oil. So to shut down the Strait of Hormuz will be literally shutting down Iran's lifeline in terms of oil export and revenue. So I think what we have seen during the 12-day war is essentially a validation of the Chinese argument that we're susceptible, but we're not vulnerable. Why? Because everyone's interests have been bonded together in the security or the continued openness or the smooth operation of the oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's a little bit too optimistic because Iran still could have made that choice. If Iran decided to go all in, they still could have shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and China's oil import would have been affected in that extreme scenario. But at least in the 12-day war, we did not see that happening.
So one last question, 2 parts. How does the Trump administration's response to the war shape China's view of the United States? You know, with their views in China that, Trump doesn't want to see a war anywhere. He wants to end all wars, and that therefore the U.S. use of force in Iran will reinforce deterrence and underscore the fact that if, when necessary, Trump is willing to use force. And of course, second part of the question is the implications then for Xi Jinping's calculus about using force against Taiwan. And lots of journalists have asked me this question, so I want to throw it to you.
Yeah, I've been asked a question quite a bit as well. I do think that in the Chinese policy community, there had been this conviction or this assumption that President Trump doesn't want a war. But I think what has happened during basically from the U.S. strike of Iranian nuclear facility is that it's not that President Trump doesn't want a war. He doesn't want a war that he cannot win, and a war that he cannot win in a faster fashion, right? So when he sees the cost as relatively low and sees the prospect of victory as presumably fairly high, I think the assumption about his refrainer tendency, refraining from getting involved in military conflict in other parts of the world. I think that assumption needs to be challenged. But honestly, I haven't seen this issue being discussed as much in China. I'm currently in Beijing. I haven't seen that this issue being presented in a way of a Chinese retrospection of their assessment of President Trump's tendency to get involved or not in a Taiwan contingency. But I think at least on the issue of Trump's unlikeliness to get into a war, I think that needs to be reassessed. But then, of course, you also hear there's also the pushback, the counter argument that a quick and relatively low cost airstrike of Iran is categorically different from a U.S. military intervention in a potential Taiwan contingency, right? We're talking about very, very different scenarios here. So maybe the case of Iran is not necessarily a good reference to evaluate President Trump's tendency or his the likelihood of him getting involved in the Taiwan scenario. I think that is a legitimate argument as well. But then again, if you go back to another factor here, which is Trump's image and his authority, his credibility, his reputation, that what are the chance that President Trump would allow for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which will present a very significant challenge to his leadership credential if he does not get to intervene. If U.S. decides to sit aside, so would he be willing to tolerate that kind of disrespect or that kind of loss of his reputational power or his leadership credentials and the image of his authority and a great power leader? I think that's another factor that we need to take into consideration. But then again, if we look at how the Chinese have observed the U.S. involvement or the declining U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war, and look at how U.S. before the Israeli strike of Iran tried to refrain or constrain Israel's military activities against Iran, I think the overall assessment is that U.S. is trying to focus primarily on its domestic affairs and minimize its international entanglement at the same time.
So we've been talking with Yun Sun, who is director of both the East Asia program and the China program at the Stimson Center. And it's particularly great to get your views, Yun, from Beijing, where you've heard the latest, most recent, fresh analysis, and your insights are fantastic. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bonnie. It's always a pleasure and a great honor. Thank you.